A tragic mishap led her to the wrong destination, where fate had secretly planned her arrival all along. The little girl's whispered words would forever change the course of a reluctant bride's journey. God finally sent you to us, 5 simple words that transformed a mistake into a miracle. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Montana winter showed no mercy that afternoon. Snow howled across the empty plains, erasing every sign of life, but a lone figure trudging toward the edge of the wilderness. Mary Johnson pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little against the biting cold that seemed determined to freeze her very bones. Her boots sank deeper with each laborious step, the drifts reaching almost to her knees in some places. The journey from Missouri had drained her last reserves. 3 days by train, followed by a bone-jarring coach ride, and finally this seemingly endless walk after the driver refused to venture any farther into the approaching storm. The matrimonial agency's letter had promised a new beginning, a chance to leave behind the horrors she'd witnessed as a nurse during the war. Now, as she approached the shadow of a lonely homestead perched against the darkening sky, Mary wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Red Bluff Ranch stood like a fortress against the wilderness, weathered timber walls and a steep roof designed to shed the heavy mountain snow. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only welcoming sign in this desolate landscape. The windows reflected the dying light, revealing nothing of what waited inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, caught between fear and exhaustion. What kind of man would choose a bride sight unseen? What desperation had driven him to send for a woman from halfway across the country? The same desperation, perhaps, that had driven her to accept. Mary raised her trembling fist to knock, rehearsing her introduction one final time. But the door creaked open before her knuckles met wood. A tall man blocked the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. His eyes were as hard and gray as the winter sky that stretched endlessly behind her, his expression unreadable beneath several days' worth of stubble. The rancher's jaw clenched as he studied her, suspicion evident in every line of his face. A battered revolver glinted at his hip, not unusual in these remote territories, but the casual way his hand rested near it made Mary's throat go dry. Despite his rough appearance, one detail caught her attention: a gold ring on his finger, worn but well-maintained, betraying the ghost of a love not yet buried. Neither spoke for several heartbeats as the wind moaned around the corners of the house, carrying promises of the blizzard to come. "I'm Mary Johnson," she managed, voice wavering as the bitter Montana wind whipped at her back. Her gloved fingers clutched the travel papers that had guided her across 3 states to this desolate stretch of wilderness. "The Missouri Matrimonial Agency sent me. I'm to marry a Mr. Carter." The tall man blocking the doorway remained unmoved, his weathered face betraying nothing but cold indifference. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the fading light, a stark contradiction to the emptiness of his home. "My name's Robert Smith," he said, his voice as frigid as the air outside. "I didn't order a bride." Mary's heart sank. The exhaustion of her journey pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She'd spent her last dollars on the coach fare, sold her nursing equipment, and abandoned what little security she had back east, all for this moment that was rapidly unraveling. A violent gust slammed against her back, nearly knocking her off the porch steps. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes as she steadied herself against the wooden railing. "The letter said Red Bluff Ranch," she insisted, pulling the crumpled correspondence from her pocket. "This is Red Bluff, isn't it?" Robert's gray eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her face. "It is," he replied, already half-turning to close the door. "But there's no Carter here. You're at the wrong place." The finality in his tone sent panic surging through her veins. Night was falling rapidly, and with it, temperatures that could kill. The last coach had departed hours ago, leaving only hoofprints now buried beneath fresh snow. "Please," Mary stepped forward, desperation overriding propriety. "The storm's coming and the last coach is gone. I have nowhere else to go." Robert paused, one hand still on the door. Behind him, the fireplace cast dancing shadows across a sparse but sturdy interior. A child's wooden horse lay abandoned by the hearth, and a rifle hung above the mantelpiece. Signs of a life both practical and lonely. "There's Fort Banner," he said, though without conviction. 20 miles east." 20 miles in this? Mary gestured to the darkening sky, where heavy clouds promised hours more of punishing weather. "I won't survive the night." For a long moment, Robert studied her, taking in her travel-worn clothes, the determination in her stance despite her obvious fatigue, the quiet dignity that hadn't yet been beaten down by disappointment. "One night," he finally conceded, stepping aside just enough to allow passage. "You leave at first light." Mary nodded gratefully, knowing better than to push her luck with this stern-faced rancher. As she crossed the threshold, Robert Smith hesitated only a moment before stepping aside, his broad shoulders tense as he gestured for her to enter. "One night, no more," he stated firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to solitude. Mary Johnson exhaled deeply as she crossed the threshold, the warmth inside hitting her like a memory she feared was lost forever. After the bitter Montana wind, the modest heat felt like salvation against her chilled skin. The rancher closed the door behind her, shutting out the howling storm with a decisive thud. The house was sparse but strong, built to withstand the harsh wilderness that surrounded it. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames battling valiantly against the cold, while shadows clung to every corner like reluctant guests. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she took a tentative step forward, unsure of her place in this stranger's domain. Her eyes traveled across the room, taking in the details that told silent stories. A small child's bonnet hung from a peg next to a well-maintained rifle, the juxtaposition of innocence and protection striking in its simplicity. Near the hearth, a carved wooden horse lay abandoned, as if its owner had been called away mid-play and never returned. The sight made Mary's heart constrict with an emotion she couldn't quite name. On the mantel above the crackling fire, a faded portrait in an ornate frame overlooked the room like a silent guardian. The woman in the image had kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to reach across time. Her dark hair was arranged neatly, and she wore a lace collar that spoke of special occasion rather than daily wear. Robert followed Mary's gaze, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "She passed 3 years ago," he said, the words coming out rough, as if rarely spoken aloud. "My wife." His fingers unconsciously moved to the gold wedding band he still wore, turning it once around his finger in what appeared to be a habitual gesture. Mary nodded softly, her own ghosts stirring in the quiet of the moment. She understood loss, had carried its weight across miles and years. The former nurse recognized the signs of a home preserved in grief, where healing had stalled like a wagon in deep mud. "I'm sorry," she offered simply, knowing no words could bridge such chasms. The rancher merely nodded, then turned away to stoke the fire, adding another log with practiced movements. The silence between them was filled only by the crackling flames and the persistent howl of the wind outside, each lost in thoughts of what they'd left behind and what uncertain futures lay ahead in this isolated corner of the wilderness. "I'm not here to replace anyone," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. The weight of her journey, the disappointment, the confusion, the fear, all pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "I just have nowhere else to be." Robert Smith studied her face, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the light as he absently twisted it. A habit born of grief, perhaps. His eyes, gray as the winter sky, revealed nothing of his thoughts, but the rigid set of his shoulders spoke of a man unused to visitors disturbing his solitude. "You can sleep there," he finally said, gesturing down the narrow hallway to a spare room. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "In the morning, I'll take you back to Fort Banner. The snow should let up by then." Mary nodded, too exhausted to argue. The promise of a warm bed, even for just one night, was more than she had dared hope for when the coach had left her at the wrong destination. She turned toward the hallway, her worn boots making little sound on the wooden floorboards. The ranch house was solid but sparse, the place built for function rather than comfort. Still, it was shelter from the Montana winter that raged outside. The heaviness of loss and uncertainty settled over her as she took her first steps toward temporary sanctuary. Her fingers unconsciously moved to the hidden scar beneath her collar, a permanent reminder of the explosion that had changed her life forever during her nursing days in the war. Some wounds, she knew, never truly healed. But before she could take another step, a soft sound stopped both of them. Tiny footsteps, hesitant and echoing in the cold. The sound seemed to transform Robert instantly. His entire body tensed, and for a moment, something like panic flashed across his features. Mary turned toward the source of the sound, her heart quickening. From the shadows of the hallway came the patter of small, bare feet against the wooden floor. The rancher's hand moved instinctively toward the battered revolver at his hip, then dropped away just as quickly. "Emily," he breathed, the name escaping him like a prayer and a curse combined. Mary stood frozen, suddenly aware that she had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple case of mistaken destination. The Missouri Matrimonial Agency had made an error in sending her to Red Bluff Ranch. But perhaps, she thought with a strange flutter in her chest, it wasn't entirely a mistake after all. From the shadows of the hallway, a small figure appeared, hesitant yet determined. Emily Smith stood barefoot, her tiny toes curling against the rough wooden floorboards. The faded blue nightdress hung loosely on her thin frame, its hem frayed from years of wear. Her dark hair cascaded in tangled waves around her pale face, framing eyes that seemed impossibly old for a child so young, eyes that held secrets no little girl should ever have to keep. Robert's hand twitched at his side, not reaching for the revolver at his hip as Mary might have feared, but rather as if grasping for strength that continued to elude him. The rancher's face transformed in an instant, the hard lines softening with recognition and something that looked remarkably like fear. The child moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a wild animal. She made no sound as she crossed the room, her gaze fixed entirely on Mary. Without hesitation or introduction, Emily reached out and clutched the fabric of Mary's skirt between her small fingers. The touch was gentle yet desperate, as if the girl feared the stranger might vanish if she didn't hold on tight enough. Then came the miracle that made the entire house seem to hold its breath. Emily's lips parted, and from them emerged a voice, soft and rusty from disuse, but clear as a bell in the silent room. "God finally sent you to us." 5 simple words that fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the very foundation of the homestead. The statement wasn't a question, but a declaration of absolute certainty, spoken with the unshakable faith that only children possess. The room stilled completely. Even the howling Montana wind seemed to pause outside the windows. Mary stood frozen, unable to move or speak, the child's words echoing in her mind. She glanced at Robert, seeking explanation or guidance. Robert Smith's breath caught audibly in his throat. His weathered face drained of color as he stared at his daughter in naked astonishment. His lips formed a single word, the name emerging as barely more than an exhale. Emily, he murmured, disbelief written plainly across his features. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Mary. The girl's voice. This was clearly something extraordinary. The way Robert looked at his daughter, the shocked recognition in his eyes, told her everything she needed to know. This child, with her solemn eyes and tangled hair, had broken a silence that had clearly stretched for far too long. Emily's fingers tightened on Mary's skirt, her gaze unwavering and filled with a desperate hope that made Mary's heart ache within her chest. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever shadows haunted this family, she suddenly understood she had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple mistake of address. Mary knelt down on the rough wooden floor, her skirts pooling around her as she met the child's gaze. Emily's eyes were wide and dark, holding wisdom far beyond her years, the kind that comes only from witnessing things no child should see. "Hello, sweetheart. My name's Mary," she said softly, her voice gentle as a spring breeze. The contrast between her warm tone and the howling winter storm outside made the moment feel suspended in time. The little girl's lips quivered, her small fingers still clutching Mary's skirt with surprising strength. "Are you going to leave too?" she asked, the question barely a whisper, yet it filled the entire room with its weight. Mary's heart splintered at the words. In this child's simple question lay a universe of abandonment and loss. She thought of her own journey, the matrimonial agency in Missouri, the long coach ride through treacherous terrain, the promise of a new beginning that had led her to the wrong doorstep. Perhaps there were no wrong doorsteps after all. She cupped Emily's cheek gently, her thumb brushing away an invisible tear. The child's skin was cool to the touch, like she'd been standing in shadows too long. "No," Mary promised, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Not tonight." Robert Smith stood motionless by the fireplace, his tall frame rigid with tension. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white with strain, something fierce and afraid flickering in his eyes. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the firelight, a silent reminder of promises made and broken. The rancher's jaw worked silently, as though words were forming but couldn't find their way past his lips. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of astonishment and fear. Fear that this moment of connection might shatter if he moved or spoke. Emily's small hand reached up to touch Mary's hair, wonder replacing sorrow in her expression. "You're pretty," she whispered, the compliment so unexpected that Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. The storm outside battered the house with renewed fury, wind shrieking through the eaves and rattling the windows in their frames. Snow pelted against the glass like tiny fists demanding entry, but inside, in the circle of warmth created by the fireplace, something fragile began to stir, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground after a long winter. Robert cleared his throat, the sound startling in the quiet room. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse with disuse, "it's past your bedtime." The child's fingers tightened on Mary's skirt, her eyes pleading. Mary looked up at the rancher, a silent question in her gaze. After a moment's hesitation, he gave a small nod. "Perhaps I could tuck her in," Mary suggested quietly. And in that moment, beneath the howling of the Montana winter, 3 broken souls took their first tentative step toward healing. When morning came, the snow had only deepened, forming pristine drifts that reached halfway up the windows. Mary Johnson woke to the sound of boots stomping on the porch and the creak of the door as Robert returned from checking his livestock. His face was ruddy from the cold, ice crystals clinging to his beard. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, his voice gruff but lacking the edge from yesterday. "You can stay until the weather clears." He didn't meet her eyes, but the offer hung between them like a tentative peace offering. Mary nodded her thanks, relief washing over her. The rancher moved toward the fireplace, adding logs with practiced efficiency. Outside, Montana's wilderness had transformed into an endless sea of white, isolating the homestead even further from civilization. The days began to bleed together, marked only by meals, chores, and the persistent howl of wind. The house remained largely unchanged by Mary's presence. She moved carefully through the rooms, conscious of being an intruder in this shrine to grief. Emily appeared occasionally, a silent shadow watching from doorways before disappearing again. One afternoon, while Robert was out tending to the horses, Mary explored the parlor. A piano stood against the wall, its surface scratched and dusty from neglect. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, without pressing them, imagining the music that once filled this space. Above the instrument hung another portrait of Robert's wife, her eyes following Mary's movements. Dust had settled thick on every surface, as if time itself had stopped when she died. Mary resisted the urge to clean it away, understanding that disturbing even this dust felt like erasing a memory Robert wasn't ready to relinquish. In the spare room where she slept, Mary discovered a wardrobe containing women's clothing. Among them hung a lace dress, its blue fabric faded but the stitchwork intricate and loving. She touched it reverently, recognizing it as the same dress the woman in the portrait wore. This was a relic of another woman's life, neither fully lost to memory nor claimed by the living. That evening, as they sat in silence by the fire, Mary noticed Robert's gold wedding ring catching the light as he turned the pages of a ledger. His large hands, calloused from ranch work, handled the delicate paper with surprising gentleness. The contradiction struck her. This man, outwardly hard as the Montana winter, harbored a tenderness he kept carefully guarded. The storm continued unabated, and with it, Mary's unexpected residence at Red Bluff Ranch. She existed in limbo, no longer a stranger, not yet welcome, caught between the life she'd left behind and a future she couldn't yet imagine. Robert Smith kept his distance from Mary, his words few and carefully measured when they did cross paths in the ranch house. His eyes, gray as the Montana winter sky, would meet hers briefly before turning away, as if afraid of what might be revealed in that contact. Yet his actions spoke with a gentleness his voice could not manage. Extra logs appeared by the fireplace before dawn broke, ensuring the common room would be warm when Mary emerged from her borrowed bedroom. One morning, Mary found him outside, hammering a loose window panel against the shrieking wind. Snow collected on his broad shoulders as he worked, never complaining about the cold that turned his knuckles red. When the kettle handle broke as she prepared tea, it reappeared the next day, mended with meticulous care. These small kindnesses whispered what his lips would not: that beneath his guarded exterior lived a man who remembered how to care, even if he'd forgotten how to show it. "Thank you," Mary said simply one evening, when he'd brought in extra blankets before another frigid night descended on Red Bluff Ranch. The rancher nodded once, his wedding ring catching the firelight. "Winter's harsh out here," was all he offered, before retreating to his chair in the corner, where shadows masked his expression. Meanwhile, Emily hovered at the edges of rooms, a silent sentinel clutching her battered rag doll. The child's dark hair fell in tangles around her face, her eyes following Mary's every movement with solemn intensity. She never ventured too close, but neither did she stray far, like a wild creature drawn to warmth, yet wary of the flame. Mary noticed how the girl's fingers would twist the doll's faded dress whenever Robert spoke too loudly or moved too suddenly. During meals, Emily would watch Mary's hands as she cut her food or poured water, studying these ordinary motions as if they contained some secret knowledge. One evening, when Mary sat mending a tear in her shawl, she felt a presence beside her chair. Emily stood there, not speaking, just watching the needle rise and fall through the fabric. Without a word, Mary shifted slightly, making space beside her. After a moment's hesitation, Emily perched on the edge of the seat, her small body tense but determined. They sat that way for nearly an hour, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. From his corner, Robert watched, his expression unreadable, though his hands had stilled on the hunting knife he'd been cleaning. Each day brought a subtle thaw between them all, A wordless trust building slowly, like the first tentative shoots of spring pushing through snow after a brutal winter. Nothing was said, nothing was promised, but something was changing in the frozen household on Red Bluff Ranch. One afternoon, Emily tiptoed into the kitchen where Mary Johnson was preparing a simple stew. The little girl's dark hair was loosely braided, her movements hesitant as she approached the table. Without a word, she slid a piece of paper across the worn wooden surface. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the drawing, her breath catching in her throat. 3 stick figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright yellow sun. One tall, with dark scribbles for hair, one with yellow strands flowing from her head, and one small figure between them. Above the trio, in wobbly, uncertain letters, was written a single word: Mama. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she pressed the paper to her heart, the weight of that simple word nearly overwhelming her. "It's beautiful, Emily," she whispered, kneeling to the child's level. "Is this us?" The girl nodded, her solemn eyes watching Mary's reaction carefully. When Mary opened her arms, Emily stepped into them, allowing a brief embrace before darting away again. The following morning, Mary woke to the smell of something burning. She hurried to the kitchen to find Emily standing on a wooden stool, her face smudged with flour as she struggled with a cast-iron pan. Robert stood in the doorway, his expression caught between amusement and concern. "She insisted on making you breakfast," he explained quietly. "Wouldn't let me help." Emily proudly presented a plate of misshapen, partially burned biscuits. Mary took one and bit into it, tasting too much salt and not enough butter, but she smiled with genuine warmth. "These might be the best biscuits I've ever tasted," she declared, watching as Emily's face transformed with a shy, hesitant smile, the first Mary had seen from her. Robert's eyes softened at the sight, though he quickly turned away when Mary glanced in his direction. Later that day, as weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds, Mary sat in the parlor chair near the fireplace, reading from the worn Bible she'd brought with her from Missouri. The pages were dog-eared, marked with years of seeking comfort in familiar verses. Emily approached cautiously before climbing into Mary's lap without invitation. The child settled against her chest, small fingers twisting the fabric of Mary's sleeve as she listened to the gentle cadence of the woman's voice. Mary felt the girl's warmth against her, a physical reminder of what she'd never thought she could have. From across the room, Robert watched them, his weathered face unreadable. But when Emily's eyes drifted closed, her breathing steady against Mary's chest, something in his gaze shifted. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself since his wife's disappearance. From the kitchen window, Robert Smith observed the scene unfolding in the yard. Mary knelt beside Emily in the snow, helping the child build a small fortress of packed white powder. The rancher's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes followed their movements with quiet intensity. The bond forming between the woman and his daughter was undeniable, fragile as a winter sunrise, but growing stronger each day. Inside the house, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, yet a different kind of coldness lingered in the corners. 3 years of grief had seeped into the very walls. Robert ran his fingers over the wooden horse abandoned by the fireplace, remembering how Emily used to gallop it across the floor, her laughter filling every room. That sound had disappeared along with her mother. Mary's arrival had changed something. The child who had barely spoken now followed the blonde woman everywhere, tugging at her skirts and watching her with those solemn eyes that seemed to hold the weight of mountains. Yet Emily still wouldn't speak of that night, the night her mother vanished. The silence in the house remained thick with unspoken truths. Later that afternoon, while Mary helped the widow Martin with her mending, Robert found himself alone in the house. He noticed Mary's small carpet bag partially open in her room as he passed. A folded paper caught his attention, half slipping from a hidden pocket. He hesitated, his conscience warring with curiosity. The letter was addressed to Mary Johnson from a doctor in Missouri. The handwriting was elegant, the paper quality fine, but the message contained within struck like a physical blow. The doctor expressed regret that despite her remarkable recovery from injuries sustained during her nursing service in the war, the damage to her womb was irreversible. The chance of her bearing children was virtually non-existent. Robert carefully refolded the letter along its well-worn creases. So this was why she had traveled so far to marry a stranger, a woman damaged by war, seeking a new beginning where her past wouldn't define her. He returned the letter exactly as he'd found it, a heaviness settling in his chest. That evening, as Emily dozed by the fire clutching her rag doll, Robert watched Mary darning a sock by lamplight. Her hands moved with practiced precision, mending what was broken. The truth of her letter lingered between them like an unhealed wound. One more secret in a house already overflowing with them. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting elongated shadows across the wooden floor of Red Bluff Ranch. Mary Johnson sat in a worn armchair, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her shawl. Outside, the Montana wind howled like a wounded animal. But inside, a different kind of tension filled the air. Robert Smith cleared his throat, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight. "I found a letter," he said, his voice low but clear. Mary's body went rigid, her blue eyes widening with recognition. Shame and hurt flashed across her face like summer lightning. She knew exactly which letter he meant, the one from the doctor in St. Louis, the one she'd kept hidden at the bottom of her trunk. "It wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "I wasn't prying," Robert explained, shifting uncomfortably. "It fell out when I moved your things during the leak in the spare room." Mary took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I was a nurse during the war," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "We were hit by artillery fire at a field hospital near Chattanooga. I was thrown 20 feet by the blast." Robert remained silent, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light. "The doctors did what they could," Mary continued, "but the damage was extensive. They told me afterward that bearing children would be nearly impossible." Her voice caught on the last words, the pain still fresh despite the years. The rancher's eyes never left her face, not with pity, as she had seen so many times before, but with something that looked remarkably like respect. "You saved lives and paid a price most men couldn't bear," he said quietly, his hand unconsciously touching the gold wedding ring he still wore. "That takes a kind of courage I understand." Mary looked up, surprised by his words. For the first time since arriving at Red Bluff Ranch, she felt truly seen, not as damaged goods, not as a woman with something missing, but as whole and complete in her own right. "Is that why you came west?" Robert asked. "To start fresh?" "Partly," she admitted. "The agency didn't ask many questions. They just wanted women willing to travel to the frontier." Emily's wooden horse lay abandoned by the hearth, a silent reminder of the child sleeping upstairs, a child who needed a mother's love as much as Mary needed to give it. "We all have our scars," Robert said, his gaze drifting to the portrait of his wife on the mantel. "Some you can see, some you can't." The quiet between them shifted, no longer the cold silence of strangers, but the gentle hush of two wounded souls beginning to heal. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside Red Bluff Ranch, something warm and fragile had begun to grow. Mary's fingers trembled as she held the drawing she'd found beneath Emily's pillow. The crude pencil strokes depicted a woman with arms stretched wide, a dark shadow pulling her away, and another figure lying motionless on the ground. The childish scrawl beneath it read, "Pa is sleep." The paper felt heavy in her hands, weighted with unspoken horrors. That evening, after Emily had been tucked into bed, Mary approached Robert in the parlor. The rancher sat by the fireplace, the flames casting long shadows across his weathered face. His gold wedding ring caught the light as he stoked the embers. "I found something," Mary said softly, extending the drawing. Emily made this. Robert Smith took the paper, his expression shifting as he studied the images. The color drained from his face. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards. For several minutes, he said nothing, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of Montana wind. "The night Sarah disappeared," he finally began, his voice barely audible. "I'd been drinking. Too much." His fingers clenched around the drawing, crinkling its edges. "We argued. I remember her shouting. Then, nothing. I woke on the floor the next morning with blood on my hands." Mary sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching. "Blood? On my shirt, my hands." He looked at his palms, as if the stains might still be visible. Sarah was gone. Emily wouldn't speak, not a single word since that night. "The sheriff, my cousin, came by, said there wasn't enough evidence to suggest foul play." "But you've always wondered," Mary whispered. Robert nodded, the firelight catching the moisture in his eyes. "I've torn this ranch apart looking for answers. Dug up the yard, searched the creek beds, questioned every traveler. Nothing." Mary studied the drawing again. "Emily was there that night. She saw something." "I was asleep in the drawing," he said, pointing to the figure on the ground. "If I didn't hurt Sarah, then who did?" Mary placed her hand near his, not quite touching. "Do you believe you hurt her?" she asked gently. Robert's jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath his stubbled cheek. His wedding ring glinted as he closed his fist. "I don't know," he admitted, the words seemingly torn from his throat. "I loved her, but I can't remember. And that's the hell I've lived in for 3 years, not knowing if these hands—" He couldn't finish. The piano in the corner stood silent, another relic of Sarah Smith's life, untouched since her disappearance. Mary looked at the instrument, then back at the drawing, at the looming shadow figure that wasn't Robert. "What if," she said carefully, "you weren't the only one here that night?" With Robert gone to town for supplies, Mary seized the opportunity to seek answers. She wrapped herself in a thick shawl and trudged through the melting snow toward the only neighbor within walking distance, Mrs. Martha Martin, a widow whose small cabin sat nestled against a stand of pines half a mile away. The elderly woman welcomed Mary with surprising strength, her gnarled hands guiding her visitor to a chair by the fire. Despite her failing eyesight, Mrs. Martin's mind remained sharp as a newly honed blade. "I've been wondering when someone would come asking," the widow said, pouring steaming tea into chipped cups. 3 years is a long time to let ghosts rest undisturbed." Mary's fingers tightened around her cup. "I need to know what happened to Robert's wife." Mrs. Martin's expression darkened. "I was awake that night. My joints pain me worse in winter." She leaned forward, voice dropping. Heard a scream cut through the darkness. Not animal, not wind, human. A woman's terror. The widow described how she'd sent her late husband's farmhand to investigate at first light. He found footprints in the fresh snow, 2 sets leaving the Smith property, only 1 returning. Blood on the porch steps. "And the sheriff?" Mary asked, remembering Emily's drawings. "Sheriff Thomas Smith," Mrs. Martin scoffed. "Robert's cousin. Came out, looked around, declared Sarah must have wandered off in the night. Said Robert had been drinking, couldn't remember clearly." Her cloudy eyes narrowed. "Hushed it all up to protect the family name." Mary's mind raced, connecting fragments like a patchwork quilt. The child's drawings, Robert's haunted silences, the ranch hand who'd been there that night. Was there someone working at Red Bluff then? Someone who might have— "Daniel Brown," Mrs. Martin interrupted, spitting the name like poison. "Disappeared right after. Some say he headed to Wyoming territory." She reached for Mary's hand. "That little girl saw something terrible. Stopped speaking the very next day." As Mary walked back to the ranch, her thoughts swirled like the melting snow around her boots. A missing woman whose fate remained unknown. A child haunted by memories too terrible to speak. A man broken by guilt and silence, drinking to forget what he couldn't remember. The past, buried beneath years of snow and silence, was stirring back to life. And Mary realized with growing certainty that uncovering the truth might be the only way to heal the broken family she was slowly, inexplicably beginning to love. Inside the house, the cold began to retreat like a reluctant visitor finally taking leave. The crackling fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the wooden floors as winter's grip loosened day by day. For the first time since Mary Johnson had arrived at Red Bluff Ranch, warmth seemed to be seeping not just into the rooms, but into their lives. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, her small fingers working determinedly with needle and thread. Mary had found scraps of fabric in an old trunk and decided to teach the child to sew. The little girl's stitches wandered like uncertain footprints across the cloth, but her concentration never wavered. "Look!" Emily exclaimed, her voice a tinkling chime that startled both adults. The sound of her laughter, so rare and precious, filled the room like sunshine. She held up her creation, a misshapen pouch with uneven seams, beaming with pride. "That's beautiful work," Mary praised, gently examining the crooked stitches. "You're a natural, Emily." Robert Smith stood in the doorway, arms folded across his chest, watching the scene unfold. Mary noticed how the tension had melted from his shoulders, how his eyes had softened when looking at his daughter. The ranch owner still carried his grief like a shadow, but it no longer seemed to consume him entirely. The next morning brought clear skies, and Robert suggested they take Emily outside. "She needs fresh air," he said simply, his voice gruff but kind. In the yard, Robert lifted his daughter onto the back of a gentle chestnut mare. Emily's legs dangled on either side of the horse, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. The child's face transformed with delight as Robert led the horse in slow circles around the yard. "Careful now," he cautioned, but his tone carried no real worry. Mary stood by the fence, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the lingering chill. She watched as Emily's laughter rang out across the snow-covered landscape, bright and clear as a bell. For a moment, the ranch seemed less isolated, less haunted by its past. "She trusts you," Mary observed, as Robert brushed snow from his daughter's cap with gentle fingers. He paused, looking up at Mary with something unreadable in his expression. "I guess she knows when someone's worth trusting," he replied, a faint smile breaking through the usual stoicism of his weathered face. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Mary felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid against the Montana sky, no longer just a shelter from the storm, but slowly becoming something that felt remarkably like home. That night, as a blizzard rattled the windows, Mary stepped outside to fetch a bucket. The cold air bit through her thin dress, stealing her breath before she could even gasp. Snowflakes swirled around her like angry spirits, their dance illuminated by the faint glow from the ranch house windows. Before the chill could settle into her bones, warmth enveloped her shoulders. Robert had followed her out, draping his heavy coat over her slender frame. His rough hands lingered near her neck, adjusting the collar to shield her from the wind. Mary Johnson turned to thank him and found herself caught in his gaze. His eyes weren't cold anymore, just tired and open, in a way that made her breath catch. The hardness that had defined Robert Smith since her arrival had softened, like ice yielding to the first touch of spring. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Storm's getting worse." Mary nodded, clutching the wooden bucket. "I didn't want to trouble you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Trouble's been here long before you arrived." Back inside, the fire glowed golden, casting dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings of the homestead. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, her small chest rising and falling beneath her patchwork quilt. The rancher stoked the flames, adding another log from the pile he'd chopped that morning. Sarah loved nights like this, Robert spoke softly, breaking their comfortable silence. The storms. Said they made the house feel like the only place in the world. He settled into his chair, eyes fixed on the portrait above the mantel. She always wore blue. Said it reminded her of the sky in summer. Mary watched his profile, illuminated by firelight. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She kept this ranch alive when I couldn't, he continued, his voice thick with memory. After the drought of '73, I was ready to give up. She wouldn't hear of it. His fingers moved to the gold band that had never left his hand. I still wear this, he murmured, twisting it slightly. Afraid I'll forget her voice if I take it off. Mary moved closer, her steps quiet on the wooden floor. With gentle courage, she laid her hand over his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm. Maybe she wants you to remember more than just her voice. Maybe how much you still have left to give. Robert covered her hand with his own, calloused fingers warm against her skin. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside Red Bluff Ranch, something long frozen had begun to thaw. The days grew longer, the snow receding like a reluctant tide. Spring whispered promises across the Montana plains, as life at Red Bluff Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mary Johnson's nimble fingers worked the needle through fabric, repairing tears and creating small comforts for the home that had unexpectedly become hers. Robert's steady hands mended fences and repaired tools, his shoulders less burdened with each passing day. The most remarkable transformation, however, was Emily's laughter. Once as rare as rain in drought, now bubbling forth like a mountain spring. Mary hummed softly as she hung freshly washed linens. Watching Emily chase butterflies near the corral, Robert paused from his work, leaning against a fence post to observe them both, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. For precious moments, the ranch seemed touched by grace, the shadows of the past temporarily held at bay. But peace is often merely the quiet before a storm. That afternoon, the distant sound of hoofbeats broke their tranquility. A lone rider approached, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the horizon. As he drew closer, Mary noticed Robert's posture stiffen, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his revolver usually hung. The stranger dismounted with practiced ease, dust coating his weathered clothes and creasing the corners of his eyes. Something about him seemed both familiar and wrong, like a discordant note in a well-known melody. "Afternoon," he called, removing his hat. "Been a long time, Smith." Robert nodded curtly. "Daniel Brown. Didn't expect to see you back in these parts." Daniel Brown's gaze slid from Robert to Mary, a cold assessment that made her skin prickle. "Hired hand from 3 years back," he explained with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Worked the season before the missus disappeared." Emily, who had been watching from nearby, suddenly froze. Her small body went rigid, eyes widening in recognition and terror. Before anyone could react, she bolted toward the house, her little boots kicking up dust as she fled. Mary excused herself and hurried after the child, concern tightening her chest. She found Emily beneath the bed, trembling violently, small hands clutching a piece of paper. The child was frantically scribbling with a broken pencil stub, desperate, frenzied strokes forming disturbing images. A man with a blade, crimson splashes, and a shadowy figure looming over a smaller one. Mary's heart pounded with dread as understanding dawned. The ranch hand's arrival wasn't coincidence. The truth about Robert's wife, the truth Emily had been unable to speak, was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Mary's heart pounded as she moved toward the rifle mounted above the stone fireplace. Her fingers had barely brushed the cold metal when the front door crashed open, sending splinters of wood across the worn floorboards. The winter air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of danger. Daniel Brown stepped inside, his weathered face twisted into something predatory. Snow melted on his shoulders as he surveyed the room, his gaze settling on Emily, who stood frozen in terror behind Mary. "Well, well," Daniel drawled, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. Seems like the little one remembers me. His eyes, cold as Montana winter, narrowed. She remembers, don't she? Mary Johnson positioned herself between the former ranch hand and the child, her nurse's instincts kicking in despite her fear. You killed her, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Robert's wife. The accusation hung in the air between them. Daniel's smile was a slash across his face, devoid of remorse or humanity. She wasn't supposed to be there, he said, taking another step forward. Just wanted what she owed me. Neither was the kid. He jerked his chin toward Emily. Robert was too drunk to stop me, too drunk to remember what he saw. Understanding crashed over Mary like ice water. The drawings, the silence, the fear in Emily's eyes whenever strangers approached. It all made terrible sense now. The child had witnessed her mother's murder, carried that horror silently for 3 years. Daniel reached inside his coat and pulled out a hunting knife, its blade catching the firelight. Can't have you telling tales now, can I? Mary lunged for the rifle, fingers stretching desperately, but Daniel was faster. He knocked the weapon aside, sending it clattering across the wooden floor. His calloused hand clamped around her arm, yanking her away from any protection. You won't get away with this, Mary hissed, struggling against his grip. The sheriff, his cousin, Daniel laughed. Man's been covering for me since that night. Mary's gaze darted to the door, calculating escape routes, anything to protect Emily. The knife inched closer to her throat, Daniel's breath hot against her face. Nothing personal, he muttered. Just cleaning up loose ends. Behind them, Emily had pressed herself against the wall, her small body trembling. Then something shifted in her eyes, fear giving way to something fierce and protective. The little girl drew in a breath and released a scream that shattered the silence of the ranch house, a sound that carried across the snow-covered plains like a clarion call. Daniel startled, his grip loosening just enough. Mary twisted, ready to fight for both their lives, praying Robert would hear his daughter's voice and come running. Mary twisted her body violently, throwing herself between Daniel Brown and Emily. The little girl's eyes widened in terror as Mary's arms spread wide, creating a human shield. The knife came down with brutal force, biting deep into Mary's shoulder. She collapsed to her knees, warmth spreading across her dress as crimson bloomed like a terrible flower. "No!" Emily shrieked, her small hands reaching out. "Mary!" Robert's voice thundered from the doorway, raw with fury and fear. In one fluid motion, he raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the air, shattering the silence of the ranch. Daniel reeled backward, clutching his arm where the bullet had torn through flesh. His face contorted with pain and rage as he stumbled against the wall. Robert surged forward like a storm, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. With one powerful kick, he sent the knife skittering across the room, far from Daniel's reach. The former ranch hand slumped to the ground, blood seeping between his fingers. "You won't touch them again," Robert growled, pressing the rifle barrel against Daniel's chest before turning to Mary. He dropped to her side, the weapon forgotten as his hands hovered over her wound. "Stay with me," he begged, voice cracking with emotion. His fingers trembled as he pressed against the bleeding. "Please, Mary, stay with me." Emily crawled across the floor toward them, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in 3 years, her voice rang out clear and desperate. "Mama, Mama, don't go." The sound pierced the room, shocking even in the midst of chaos. Mary's eyelids fluttered as she fought to stay conscious. "Emily," she whispered, reaching for the child with a bloodied hand. "I'm here, sweetheart." Robert tore a strip from his shirt, pressing it against the wound. "Hold on, Mary, just hold on." Outside, horses thundered into the yard. The gunshot had drawn the attention of the Martins and 2 other neighboring families who had been riding the fence line nearby. Mrs. Martin burst through the door first, her weathered face paling at the scene before her. "Get the doctor from Fort Banner," Robert shouted, not looking up from Mary. The old woman's eyes narrowed when they fell on Daniel. "That's him," she hissed. "The man I saw that night." Two men seized Daniel, recognition dawning on their faces as they remembered the ranch hand who had disappeared the same night as Robert's wife. They dragged him outside, his protests fading as Mary's breathing grew shallow. "Don't leave us," Robert whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. Emily's small hand found Mary's fingers and squeezed tight. The truth, buried for 3 long years beneath snow and silence, was finally clawing its way to the surface. And as neighbors secured Daniel for the sheriff, Mary fought to hold on to the family she had found in the most unexpected place. For 7 days and 7 nights, Mary Johnson hovered between life and death, her wound festering despite Mrs. Martin's poultices. The knife had cut deep, stealing her strength but not her will. Robert remained vigilant at her bedside, his large hands gentle as they changed bandages and spooned broth between her pale lips. His wedding ring glinted in the lamplight as he whispered prayers and promises. "Fight, Mary," he would murmur when no one else could hear. "Emily needs you. I need you." Emily refused to leave the sick room, creating a small nest of blankets beside Mary's bed. The child mimicked Robert's every movement, dabbing Mary's forehead with cool cloths, arranging wildflowers in chipped cups, and singing fragments of lullabies half-remembered from another time. Her tiny fingers would straighten the blankets with determined precision. "She's my mama now," Emily declared one evening, her voice clear and certain. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Robert turned away, but not before Mary glimpsed the tears tracking down his weathered face. In that moment, he understood what he stood to lose. Not just a woman who had stumbled into their lives, but the heart of their makeshift family. When the fever finally broke, Mary's recovery was slow but steady. Yet as her strength returned, so did her doubts. She watched Robert and Emily together, the way his hand rested protectively on his daughter's shoulder, how the child's eyes followed him with trust restored. What place could she have in their lives? A barren woman, a stranger still. They deserved better than her broken pieces. One night, while Robert tended the horses and Emily slept, Mary penned a letter. Her handwriting wavered as she explained why she must leave, how she couldn't give them the future they deserved, how they needed someone whole. She wrote of her love for them both, a love that demanded sacrifice. Tears blotted the paper as she signed her name. Before dawn, Mary packed her few belongings into her battered traveling bag. She placed the letter on the kitchen table, weighted with the wooden horse. Her heart splintered with each quiet movement, but Emily, ever watchful, had awakened. The child found the letter, her small fingers tracing words she couldn't fully read but somehow understood. Horror dawned in her eyes as she realized what was happening. Without a sound, she slipped from the house into the swirling snow, clutching only her rag doll against the biting cold. When Mary discovered the empty bed, panic seized her throat. The letter lay discarded on the floor, tiny footprints in the fresh powder leading toward the pine woods where darkness still clung to the trees. Panic seized Mary Johnson as she and Robert frantically searched the swirling snow for Emily. The blizzard had intensified, turning the Montana landscape into a blinding white void. They called her name until their voices grew hoarse, the wind stealing their words almost before they left their lips. "She couldn't have gone far," Robert shouted over the howling gale, his face etched with terror. The rancher pushed forward, breaking trail through drifts that reached his knees. Mary followed, her heart pounding with each labored step, her thoughts racing to the worst possibilities. After an hour that felt like eternity, Robert spotted a small dark shape beneath a towering pine. They rushed forward, finding Emily huddled against the trunk, her rag doll clutched tight against her chest, her small body shivering violently. "You don't want me anymore," she sobbed when she saw them, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Her lips had turned an alarming shade of blue, her dark hair crusted with ice. Mary fell to her knees in the snow, gathering the child into her arms. Tears froze on her cheeks as she pressed Emily close. "I was never leaving you," she whispered fiercely. "I thought I was protecting you both. I was wrong, so wrong." The little girl's body trembled against hers, from cold or emotion or both. Mary unwrapped her shawl and tucked it around Emily's shoulders, trying to share what little warmth she had. Robert knelt beside them, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the wind. Without hesitation, he removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around them both. His voice broke as he spoke. "You're our little girl, Emily. Nothing changes that. Nothing ever will." The child looked up at him, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "But the letter said—" "The letter was a mistake," Mary interrupted gently. "I was afraid I couldn't be what you both needed. I can't give you brothers or sisters." Her voice caught on the admission. Robert's weathered hand found hers beneath the coat. "We don't need anything more than what we already have," he said, his gray eyes holding hers with newfound certainty. Emily's small arms locked around Mary's neck, clinging with surprising strength. "Will you be my mama forever?" she asked, the question hanging between them like a prayer. Mary looked at the child's face, then at Robert's, seeing in both the same raw hope. "Forever, if you'll have me," she promised, her voice steady despite her tears. Robert helped them both to their feet, supporting Mary as she carried Emily. The former nurse cradled the child close, feeling the small heart beating against her own. Robert's arm encircled them protectively as they turned toward home. In the heart of the winter woods, surrounded by the wild Montana wilderness, a family, battered by loss, haunted by violence, and remade by love, finally became whole.